From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming up today, K-State's Jaymelynn Farney is joined by the University of Tennessee's Justin Rhinehardt. They'll discuss several principles of making cattle reproduction decisions based on individual herd production goals and a variety of factors that influence those goals. Also today from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State, a look at two topics: the economics of purchasing a new bull for spring breeding and developing an extended grazing program to cut back on hay feeding costs. Featured there, Dustin Pendell, Philip Lancaster, Brad White, and Bob Larson. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham on the steps to successfully planting a new landscape tree this spring. That and more coming up on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. Good to have you along on this Thursday. Well, during our first half hour today, information for you cow-calf producers on several aspects of herd management, drawn from 2 regularly airing podcasts hosted by K-State specialists. The first on making cattle reproduction decisions. This appropriate for the spring breeding season coming up, and it's from a recent edition of Dr. J's Beef. That's a podcast series hosted by K-State Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney. And here, Jaymelynn talks with University of Tennessee Beef Reproduction Management Specialist Justin Rhinehardt.
One of the first things that I want to visit with you about is, what are the benchmarks you use for reproductive performance in a cow herd?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I like that you start out with that one, because I really do think that we need targets to be able to aim for and to measure ourselves against. You know, I shoot for at least a 90 to 92% weaning rate. And then if we can shoot for a 90 to 92% weaning rate, then we can kind of work back from there to know, what we need our pregnancy rates to be. And then even from there, we can work back to know, how long we have in our postpartum interval from the last time that set of cows calved until we need to have them rebred, and to do all that within a tight calving season. So honestly, the main benchmark that I shoot for is a 90+% weaning rate. And the reason I set my benchmark for weaning rate at least 90%, most of that's an economic type decision, but I feel like that's at very least the sweet spot we can get to without over-investing in the cows to the degree that we can't recoup that investment. That usually hits the mark for weaning rate percentage.
And that's a really good benchmark measure that can be used regardless of the area of the country you're in. Because, I have podcast listeners from all over the country, and we do have quite a bit of different inputs as associated with cattle management. And in regards to that, what do you think is the most important aspect of managing reproduction in your cow herd?
That's another really good question. And to me, the direct answer to that is managing the calving season. So if there's one management practice that I can identify that is the most important, specifically to reproduction, I would say this for any management practice. I would say having a defined calving season and managing that calving season to be as restricted as possible. So that means a defined and restricted breeding season in some form. We'll probably get into talking about the specifics of how that can look different than what our actual calving season looks like, but a defined breeding and calving season to me is the most important thing we can do in reproductive management. But honestly, I would say the most important thing that we can do in management in the cow herd in any regard, because I think of it as kind of the gateway to doing all the other management practices correctly. So oftentimes if I'm speaking to a group of producers, I'll ask them, what do you think is the most important thing to manage in your cow herd? And I'll get answers that are really good answers like health, vaccination protocols, nutrition, mineral management, any number of different things, genetic selection, all that. And those are all very important. But if you find one, if you kind of boil it down to the single thing that makes all that easier and I guess, keeps us focused on being able to do those things properly and at the right time, that would be having that defined calving season and defined breeding season. So if you think about nutrition, if I have cattle in the same herd that are in peak lactation and some that are dry cows because I don't manage the calving season, there's nothing I can do as specifically as I need to with nutrition. I'm either feeding too much and when I say feeding, delivering nutrition in some way, whether it's grazing, supplemental feed, whatever the case may be. I'm either offering too much nutrition and wasting money on one set of those cattle, or I'm not providing enough on another set of those cattle and to support the production that I need from them. So, health protocols, when we think about weaning and vaccinating calves, if I have in the same pasture, same range, a calf that's 2 months old and a calf that's 6 or 7 months old, there's no vaccination protocol. I can go in there with the cows or the calves and apply to everything at the same time. So I really think we can bring it all back all the time to managing a defined calving season as the most important reproductive management component and really the most important in the overall herd. A lot of times I'll use the analogy of row crop production, and I'll say, have you ever known a row crop producer to take the planter out and, take a pass around and do the hedgerows and then park the planter for a couple of weeks and then go back and make a couple of other passes and park the planter for a month? I mean, just nobody staggers out crops like that. So if we really do think about our cow-calf production as producing a calf crop and take that word very seriously in it, then I think that focuses the end on that, calving season management being the most important defined calving season.
And have you noticed certain characteristics of producers who consistently have good results with managing reproduction, even beyond that calving season?
I have. To me, so I've been beef cattle specialist for, I guess, 13 or 14 years, somewhere around in there. And after you do it for several years, you start to pick up on key characteristics of individual producers that folks would look to, to get ideas from, and kind of leaders in their communities or production groups, if it's seed stock or commercial or whatever. And to me, the thing that stands out, it's not as maybe as specific as some other characteristics you think about, but it's somebody that is able to kind of step back and have a picture on the long term and understand that when I'm looking at decisions to be made now, I'm not just thinking about how that affects this year, maybe in regard to reproductive function, performance or economics, those kinds of things. We often get kind of pulled into looking at that and just that single year factor. And it's understandable, right? I mean, it's hard not to just focus on the immediate and what's most tangible. But the folks that to me tend to be more successful with reproductive management and by way of doing that are more successful in cow-calf production overall, they step back and say, okay, this decision is going to affect my bottom line this year, but I also need to consider how it will affect what I do next year and 3 years down the road, 10 years down the road, when my daughter has the herd or my grandson inherits the herd, those kinds of things. I think those are the folks that it takes a long time to get to where they are, but they're diligent in playing the long game, as I call it, and looking down the road at the impact of each decision. And maybe, folks looking at it from the outside in will see them make a decision that doesn't make any sense in that year. But when you step back away from it and take a bigger scope of what they're trying to accomplish, then you see that, okay, that's how they end up, with a, 92% calf crop that's calved out in 45 days to a 45-day breeding season. So that, to me, is the biggest characteristic that I see in producers that are very successful with reproductive management.
How do you go about diagnosing whether you had a reproductive issue in your cow herd for that given year? That's one thing that we deal with, especially a lot in Kansas, is some fertility associated with weather events. And and some of those things like that I was going to just ask you to touch on using reproduction as a diagnostic tool.
Sure. And the way I explain this and the way I found it kind of makes the message, I guess, stick with folks is I'll ask them, how many ways do you know to detect pregnancy in cattle? And of course, there's, hand palpation, the old traditional stuff, hand palpation, ultrasound, now blood test, and the PAG testing has become, a lot more widely used. And certainly I think routine pregnancy diagnosis, often more than once per year, is going to be a key factor of that, having a veterinarian involved. You can start to see these things coming if it's a year-over-year effect. So if I sit down with a producer that tells me I had really poor reproductive performance this year, usually the first thing I'll ask them is to see records from previous years. I might not just be looking at percentage pregnancy rate or percentage calving. I'll probably also be looking at the distribution of that calf crop. And usually what you'll see leading up to a year, again, if it's a year-over-year thing and not a one-time disease or really strange weather pattern, a lot of times what you'll see is they're clipping along at a 90%, 90+% calving rate to get to that 90% weaning rate I was talking about earlier. But then, they kind of get down in the high 80s, and then you're in a little bit lower in the mid 80s, and you creep into just a year-over-year loss of reproductive performance. That's very different than having a 95% calf crop every year, and then all of a sudden you're in the low 80s. That's a different scenario. So I use those kinds of things. So, and you can take that all the way down to cow families and half sibs by sire, those kinds of things. So I use all that for diagnostics.
Excerpts there from a recent podcast featuring the University of Tennessee's Justin Rhinehardt and K-State's Jaymelynn Farney. Now, Justin had much more to say on this topic of fine-tuning beef repro decisions. On the full podcast, you can find that by searching simply for Dr. J's Beef. We'll return shortly on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. And next up, a couple of more topics attuned to you, cow-calf producers. These as covered in the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. And to be precise, on being strategic when purchasing that new bull for the commercial cow-calf herd. Also, thoughts on conserving hay feeding costs by extending the grazing season. On board this time, livestock economist Dustin Pendell, cattle nutritionist Philip Lancaster, and veterinarians Bob Larson and Brad White.
Now's the time where I'm going to ask you guys a loaded question relative to bull sales. I want to know how much I can pay for a bull. How do I figure out if I'm a commercial cow-calf producer, how can I determine what I can afford to spend on a bull at the sale this year?
That is kind of a loaded question. Yeah. So I'll go off track just a second. So I was talking to a guy once after a bull sale that I know that he had gone to. And I said, well, was it a good sale? He goes, well, every sale is a good sale, either for the buyer or the seller or both. And, I'll just start. I'll answer the easy part, and then I'll turn it to Philip and Dustin to fill in the hard part. But I can picture spending not enough for bulls. So if I try to go at the very low end and pay as little as possible, probably I don't know very much about that bull. I don't know very much about the producers that produce that bull. Or I do know something about him and he's pretty below average. I think that's a bull that I probably want to avoid. So I don't want to spend too little. I want to know some information about the bull, about the person that the ranch that provided him and grew him. And I want some EPDs, some numbers that can give some prediction about how that bull is going to perform. On the other side, you could spend too much in that, if this is a bull he's going to have 25, 30 calves per year, and I'm going to own him for 4 years, his value has to show up in that number of calves. And if I pay too much for him, I'm raising my bull cost per calf sold or per pound weaned above what I can really afford. So I'm going to start by putting brackets on it. I can picture spending too little for a bull, and I can picture spending too much for a bull. Now I'll turn it to Dustin and Philip, and they can say, well, how to hit that middle.
That's a pretty good, you put these brackets too little, too high.
Yeah, they're kind of wide.
I would say, as an economist, my responses go, it depends. Right? I mean, it depends on a lot of factors, I think. One thing, though, you mentioned how long is it going to be? I mean, is it 4 years, 5 years, or is it 2 years? How many cows? Is it 25? I mean, or is it 30? Because you add an extra 5 cows. I mean, that brings that service cost per year down. You know, probably not super common, but do you have a spring calving herd, or is it spring and fall? So I think there's a lot of factors that come into play depending on, but I think if you're thinking, you know, let's say a $3,000 versus a $5,000 bull, that's $2,000 is quite a bit of money, but is it a lot of money when you think about it? Again, it comes back to some of those questions I just asked. How many cows? How long is it going to be in? And so those are some of the things I think you really want to pencil out as you're thinking about what is that price that you can afford for a bull.
Do you think the bull market is pretty efficient, or rather higher priced bulls are higher quality and lower priced bulls are lower quality, and I could just use price as a gauge of quality?
You know, that's a really good question. I suspect some of those bulls that, you know, go for a lot of money, I'm sure they are higher quality, and they're probably going to be using those for obviously breeding a lot of different cows all over the country. I would say probably, although there's always those exceptions, right?
Well, I think you're right in general terms, yeah. But I think quality in this case is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? So what you alluded to, Dustin, if I'm a commercial cow herd that sells at weaning, that may be my judge of quality may be a little bit different than a cow herd that's going to maintain ownership on those calves all the way through the feeding phase. So I think to a degree, you're right. To a degree, there's some efficiency. And in general, those bulls are higher quality, but they may or may not be higher quality to me. Philip, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. How much can I afford to pay for a bull? We'll let these guys dance around the topic.
Yeah,
I'm going to let you just go ahead and answer. He's going to say, he's going to give us a dollar number.
Yeah. I'll just, I don't know. I can, 2,500. There you go. There's your number. All right. But I think the way to look at it is based on what you need. If I'm buying a bull and I'm spending money because he's got really high carcass EPDs, but I sell my calves at weaning, for example, I'm overpaying for a bull because I'm paying for a bunch of qualities that I don't need. Not that I want to buy a bull that is below average for carcass traits, but I don't need to buy the top marbling bull in the sale if I'm selling my calves at weaning. And I think that goes for several traits. We look at what you need in the cow-calf sector. Have you got enough genetic potential for weaning weight where genetics are not your limiting factor on weaning weight, and the limiting factor is nutrition rather than it is genetics? Then paying more for higher weaning weight EPD bulls, not something you really need. Maybe you need to focus on something else. Maybe you need to reduce your cow size. Maybe you need to improve milk or some fertility traits or something like that. So I look at it based on what you need. If I'm paying for things that I don't need, I'm overpaying for a bull. If I'm not paying for things that I do need, I'm underpaying for a bull. And so I think it starts with a good assessment of what are the genetic needs of your cow herd, especially if you're going to save replacement heifers out of this bull. And so I think that's my perspective on how much to pay for a bull.
last question we have, which is really kind of a biggie, and I kind of like digging into this. And their question was, I'm getting really tired of feeding hay. We've had a long winter. It was a dry fall in parts of the country, and it's wearing me out physically and financially to continue feeding hay. And I would like to decrease my hay feeding season. So I'm going to ask you guys for your thoughts on how can I extend the grazing season. Philip, I'm going to start with you. How do I decrease the number of hay feeding days and increase the number of cow grazing days?
Well, there's lots of different ways to do this, Brad. Some common ways, or some that seem to work well, are using stockpiled forages, and crop residues are a couple of big ones. A perennial forage that I can stockpile, particularly like this question came from Missouri. Tall fescue is a great forage to stockpile in the fall for early winter, late fall grazing.
Well, and when you said stockpiling, to kind of clarify, I think what you're thinking of is you got to have cattle off of that piece of ground for a while, possibly. And if you're talking about fescue or a lot of different forages, put in some nitrogen, do it, kind of a strategic fertilization so that you get some nice growth while the cattle are off of it, and then bring it back on. And that can work for a lot of different areas. So to me, I'm going to summarize what I heard you say, Philip, is the first thing is, well, with the forage I have, say there's a certain kind of species mix of forages, I can use pulling cattle off of that. And it could be management intensive grazing or rotational grazing, or it could just be some cross fencing and some different choices to kind of give some areas some rest so that they can stockpile and then bring back in for while they're dormant. The other thing you mentioned, and you said crop residues, but really anytime I've got some different plant species that mature at different times. So yeah, that might be crop residues. It might be cover crops on crop fields, or it might be just knowing that I've got some cool season grasses in this part of the ranch and some warmer and some other types of grasses maybe introduced or native that mature at different times, and then kind of matching when those plants are highest quality. But the one take home is everything we've talked about to extend the grazing season does take management and work and some monitoring throughout the year. You can't just extend the grazing season by leaving cows out on pasture longer.
And not only, I'll put a finer point on it, not only is it management intensity, there's some expense associated with some of the stuff you guys talked about. If I'm going to stockpile, I'm going to have fertilizer expense. If I'm going to do cover crops, I'm going to have some expense. And that's something I may want to calculate, right, Dustin?
Yep. And so one thing I just want to add is if you look back at the Kansas Farm Management data over the last 5 to 7 years, what we have seen is the most profitable producers, or operations, I should say, are the operations that have lower feed expenses. Those same operations tend to have, on a per cow basis, those same operations tend to have higher pasture expenses on a per cow basis. So what it appears to be is those operations tend to extend their grazing a little longer, but the trade-off is those feed costs come down quite a bit. And those are the most profitable operations year in and year out.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University, Philip Lancaster, Dustin Pendell, Brad White, and Bob Larson. The complete podcast was just posted earlier this week. Find that at ksubci.org, ksubci.org. We'll return shortly on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here, and moving on now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, experts at a Farm Foundation session on climate and carbon markets this week laid out the possibilities for farmers in capturing carbon prompted by financial incentive and support for farmers. But they also indicated that developing the processes, the procedures, and the tools needed for the factors of measuring carbon and verifying activities will take time to develop. These experts also stressed a need for farmers to be able to get benefits from deploying carbon capture efforts, and that failure to make that happen will limit the effectiveness of any such program. While corporate efforts are being seen, those participating in the forum related a view that government could play a key role in research into technologies and practices. That effort will not be an immediate shift, they say, some indicating it could take upwards of 20 years for moving to new farming practices that sequester more carbon in the soil. And for farmers that have already deployed those efforts, one of the keys may be having the data to back that up when their actions have meant what those actions have meant, that is, in terms of their carbon capture. Carbon measurement and carbon prices remain two major components ahead, especially for those already deploying practices like minimum till or no-till. Developing ways to measure those actions retroactively will also be key, they say. Imported American beef in Japan has proven so popular that it has now topped the annual limits called safeguards, and the U.S. Meat Export Federation is urging Japan to raise that threshold. Japan's import limit for American beef of 242,000 metric tons was reached earlier this month, so tariffs will be raised from 25.8% to 38.5%. That'll continue for 1 month starting today through April the 16th. That's according to the Japanese Finance Ministry. The Meat Export Federation says that triggering of the beef safeguard was not unexpected. It said, in fact, based on its 15-year outlook, USMEF projected that without an increase to the safeguard threshold, Japan's imports of U.S. beef are likely to trigger the annual safeguard every year. A bilateral trade agreement signed back in 2019 provided for U.S. beef imports to gradually rise and taxes to drop from 38.5% to 25.8% and eventually to 9% over 15 years. The Japan-U.S. trade agreement also said that if the safeguard gets set off, Japan would agree to consult with the U.S. to adjust that level. Now, Japan's imports of U.S. beef rose 3% in the first part of the year compared to the previous year. American beef exports to South Korea and China have also been growing, and in 2018, the U.S. exported $2.1 billion worth of beef and beef products to Japan. Japan is the largest export market for beef out of the U.S. based on value. The USDA recently announced some expiring contracts under its Conservation Stewardship Program can apply for renewal by the end of this month. With more on that is the USDA's Rod Bain.
Over 11,000 contracts under the Agriculture Department's Conservation Stewardship Program are set to expire at year's end. However, as Natural Resources Conservation Service Deputy Chief Jimmy Bramblett notes,
normally the contract period is originally for 5 years, and there's authorization in the Farm Bill to renew those contracts for another 5 years.
However, to renew those contracts,
we're asking our clients that are working with us in those situations to visit our field offices by March the 31st.
Not only that, but the Deputy Chief explains under the 2018 Farm Bill, this new CSP contract renewal process is also a competitive one. More information about CSP and contract renewals are available at local NRCS field offices or online at www.nrcs.usda.gov. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And the Federal Claims Court has now delayed a new class action lawsuit that seeks compensation for farmers and other property owners who suffered property losses from repeated floods on both sides along a 240-mile stretch of the Missouri River. This lawsuit, filed on behalf of more than 60 landowners, has been delayed pending a possible appeal to be filed on behalf of farmer Roger Eidecker and 2 other farmers who won their bellwether cases last year. It's on now to this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, and standing by, as always, is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Dr. Brian McCornack is joining us, professor and department head of entomology at Kansas State University. And Dr. McCornack, you are a part of a research project that's been funded by checkoff dollars from the soybean folks about the tactics to manage key insect pests as well. So talk about some of the background and goals that you would like to see for this year. And
so this is a project that the Soybean Commission has funded for several years, and it really addresses, I guess, some pests that we've been dealing with in Kansas for a long time, like soybean podworm and some of the other defoliators. You know, they're basically consuming leaves and causing issues. At the same time, it's also funding work to do some exploration for some emerging pests. So there's a new pest that, at least in northeastern Kansas, it's not here yet, but it's on the borders, that we need to be paying attention to, which is the soybean gall midge. It's one of those that can really cause some problems and has caused some problems in Nebraska and Iowa and even in the northwest corner of Missouri. So it's one of those things where having resources like this from soybean producers is really phenomenal, because we're in the job of helping protect those yields as entomologists, and getting information to growers when and where they need it is really critical to success, at least how we see it. And this partnership is really instrumental in that.
Because in so many ways, if you don't attack it now, you really don't want to know what the consequences could be if that's the case.
Yeah, and a lot of it, too, is just knowing when to sample. I mean, when you think about how many acres there are in Kansas, when and where do you choose to invest that time? One of the projects we've been looking at trap monitoring data over several years to try to get a better understanding of when soybean podworm comes in. So, you know, it's one of those where if you don't catch it early enough and apply at the right rates and right volume of water, then all of a sudden you not only wasted insecticide application, but you could have also taken out natural enemies. So really knowing what information you have available to you to make an informed decision is really the basis of the proposal. You know, another part of the project is actually looking at moving forward host plant resistance in something we're kind of used to in corn, which is BT incorporating a plant's ability to produce a toxin to protect it from pests is another way to kind of look at even soybean production. You know, one of the objectives to look at deck D's stem borer has been a really bad pest for us and is actually increasing in importance over the last probably decade. It's really hard to protect that with an insecticide. So how do we maybe put some of those genes into the plant to help provide some protection over the course of the season? And that's another one of those objectives where that's probably more in the future, so next 2, 3, 4 years potential.
Dr. Brian McCornack, professor and department head of entomology at Kansas State University, has been our guest on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
It's time once again on Agriculture Today for our weekly horticulture segment. Springtime coming on now, and thinking about projects that you can conduct in the home landscape, here's one that's, of course, immensely popular: planting new landscape ornamental trees, as covered by our guest, horticulturist Ward Upham of K-State Research and Extension. These are straightforward, but invariably folks will miss a step or two here, Ward, so we want to be thorough as we go through these. And the starting point is tree selection, right?
That's right. Let's select the right tree for the site. In Kansas, there's a lot of trees that just won't work well for us. And so the way you pick the right tree is either to check with your local nursery person and see what they suggest, or we do have a website that they can go to and see what we recommend. And the easy way to get there is look for plants recommended for Kansas, KSU. If you put that in, that first link should be the one that you need. Once you get that tree, if you can't put it in the ground right away, make sure it stays well watered and in a shady location. You don't want it in a place where it's going to dry out quickly.
Mm-hmm. So one goes to the nursery, picks out a tree, brings it home, and before that tree goes into the ground, some preparatory steps are necessary here.
Yeah, one of the things they want to look at is all those wires, tags, all that type of stuff really needs to come off the tree. Doesn't look like they cause any damage, and they won't for several years, but eventually they can girdle a branch. And so make sure all that stuff is taken off. The other thing to look for is that root flare. Down at the bottom of the tree, you should see it where it starts to swell out, where those roots are starting to attach. Well, if you get a bald and burlap tree, sometimes there's going to be soil that's been thrown against that trunk, and that flare may be several inches below what looks like ground level. That extra soil needs to come off. If it doesn't, you're going to plant the tree too deep, and it's going to cause problems for you down the road. So if you have a balled and burlap tree, scrape any soil off till you hit that root flare.
Very important, finer point there that often goes overlooked, frankly. Dig a proper hole. What constitutes a proper hole for planting a landscape tree?
A lot of people think a proper hole is one that is very deep, and that's not what you want. You want to set that tree, once you know how big that root ball is, so it's a little bit higher than the surrounding soil. You want to make sure it doesn't sit in water. That's why you're doing that. But 3 times wider than the root ball. And that will allow those roots to get outside of that original root ball and get well established quickly. And then it's also a good idea to go out to 5 times the width of the root ball and just loosen the soil. Use a garden fork or spading fork, anything like that, in order to just loosen that soil. Makes those roots a little bit easier to get out there.
But the minimum, once again, no less than 3 times the width of that root ball.
Yes.
Be sure to observe that. And you want to clear anything away from that root ball to allow it to fan out successfully.
Yeah, so first thing, of course, you're going to have to remove those containers. If it's a container-grown plant, you're going to have to take that off before you put it in the ground. If it's balled and burlapped, however, you put it in that hole and then you remove the burlap or remove the wire cage, anything that's going to interfere with those roots. You don't leave that burlap on there. That doesn't mean you have to take it from underneath that root ball. Just cut it down around so that the sides are not covered with burlap. It's going to be better for that tree if it doesn't have to go through the burlap. Mm-hmm. And again, the wire cage, just use something in order to cut that away. Again, you may not be able to pull it out from underneath the ball, but at least you can get rid of most of it, and that's important for the health of the tree.
You've successfully placed it then. Now you backfill the hole, but with the same material you took out. Is that correct?
That's right. What you don't want to do is backfill with amended soil. In other words, you mix a bunch of peat moss in with that or existing soil and then put it back in. If you have a heavy soil, what you created is a pot that's going to fill with water when you get heavy rain, and those roots need oxygen. And so you can actually drown your tree. Now, there is a way to add organic matter, and the way you do that is you take an area that's 10 feet around where that tree is going to go, add 2 inches of organic matter such as peat moss, and then mix it in, and then dig your hole. As long as you do it that way, you're going to be okay. But if you dig your hole and just add something like peat moss to just the backfill soil, you may have created a real problem.
And backfill to the point of making sure that drainage will occur from the base of that tree?
That's right. So you don't want that water to stand around the trunk. And so, as we mentioned before, you're setting it just a little bit higher than the surrounding soil. So bring up soil to that root ball. And so you don't have it sticking up any higher, but it forms just a little bit higher. It's going to sit a little bit higher than the surrounding soil. And that will allow that tree to breathe as well as be easy to water as well.
Some other finer points here, Ward. If in the process of placing that tree in its permanent home, 1 or 2 of the branches are injured, perhaps broken, should one prune those?
Yeah, if they're injured or they're broken or you have 2 that cross and rub against each other, take those out. If you have 2 that cross, 1 has to come out. If you have 2 that form a very narrow angle, that's going to be your leader, the main branch, 1 of them has to go. And normally what you do is you take out the one that is furthest away from which way the wind blows. So the one that is left is going into the wind a little bit. The reason for that is the number of buds that you leave on that tree increases the number of roots it produces. Each of those buds produces a little bit of hormone that encourages rooting. So if you cut it back hard, you actually slow down the root development of that tree.
So be careful with what you do there. And then post-placement of that new landscape tree, management, and the obvious thing is making sure that it has adequate moisture.
That's right. So when you put it in, what a lot of people will do is fill that hole half full of soil and then water it in really well. What you're after is good contact between the roots and that soil. And so fill it half full of soil, water real well, add the additional soil to bring it up to where it should be, and then water it well again. And if you do that, that soil is going to be in good contact with the roots, and those roots are really going to take off.
And to further conserve that water, a good mulch right?
Yeah, 2 to 4 inches, somewhere right around there, and that'll help conserve moisture. It'll also help keep that soil a little bit cooler so those roots may develop a little bit quicker as well.
And it'll help with weed control around that base as well, will it not?
Sure will. What you don't want to do is do a volcano mulch. A volcano mulch is where you put that mulch around the trunk of the tree like it's a little mountain, like a little hill. That can damage the trunk. As a matter of fact, you want to pull the mulch away from that trunk maybe 2-3 inches, just so that the mulch doesn't actually contact the trunk of the tree.
Well, those are the basic ground rules for establishing a new landscape tree and making sure that your planting process gets that job done. Timely message, Ward. Thanks for coming over.
You bet.
Ward Upham, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension. And that is this week's Horticulture segment. Once more, our time's away. Thanks for being along with us, and please rejoin us right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.